Hello again! In the last video, I showed you how I altered a Vogue 1546 pattern to make a fit sample. So now let's fit it! I'm using safety pins to close the back where the zipper will be. On one side of the skirt, I cut the pleat seam allowances, and the reason I don't like to do that is because they can flip over or even turn inside out like this. So I'm going to pin the pleats into folds that I like and adjust the pattern as needed. I still don't like the side seam pleat, so I'm pinning it flat and I'll remove it from the pattern. I also don't like center back pleats. They open up and it's like a weird butt crack, but I have a plan for that. Fitting the back is pretty much impossible to do well on your own body, so it's best to use a mannequin for this. I have my waistband piece, so I'll pin that right around my natural waist. I'm pinning it onto the skirt so it will sit evenly on my waist. I'm pinning the bodice at the side seam to make it easier here. It fits pretty well. Inhale deeply and puff up your chest as much as you can to make sure you have enough room to breathe. You can see where the skirt was supposed to attach, but I'm pinning it to the waistband so that it's not curving down. Now that I'm happy with the fit, I can mark the style lines for the front yoke. My shirt actually works well for the starting point. Making sure the spider will fit, and yep, looks good. Before I took off the fit sample, I marked on both sides of the safety pins with a friction marker. Then I can mark where the waistband is going on the skirt and bodice, and mark any other alterations I made to the garment before removing the pins. You can see where I pinned the pleats. There's a gap where the seam allowance was cut. I can make up for that in the pattern and not need to cut the seam allowance away. So I'm folding the paper pattern into pleats with the revised angle as pinned on the fit sample. Once the pleats are folded, I can measure where the waistband will sit and mark it across the skirt pattern. I tape the pleats down to hold them in place. Add a 1/2 inch seam allowance and cut away the excess. Then mark where the pleats start and end, cut the tape, and notch the marks. I'm also removing some of the fullness of the pleats because they were overlapping each other, so I'm cutting out a 1/2 inch from each one. I'm marking the front yoke style line on the pattern by laying the fit sample on top and using a tracing wheel to poke holes right through the muslin into the paper. Then I can draw the line using a curved ruler. To mark where the waistband will be, I fold the waist dart and mark across it while it's folded. Add seam allowance and cut away the excess. I decided to take out the side dart. It was too much fullness for me, and instead of taking in the center back like I had pinned, I'm taking in the side seams of the front bodice. I also thought the arm curve was cutting into my armpits a little, so I'm trimming just a little bit away here. Now I need to make a new pattern piece for the front yoke. If I cut the pattern right on the line, I have to remember to add seam allowance when I cut, and sometimes I forget to do that pretty much every time. So to make it Katie-proof, I'm making a new pattern piece with seam allowance. I trace around the yoke area of the bodice and then use a tracing wheel to trace the style line. Now I can add seam allowance to the bodice and cut away the yoke, and the new pattern piece gets its own seam allowance. Lastly, the belt will just be a rectangle, so I'm making it 2.5 inches tall by half the width of the waistband, plus a 1/2 inch seam allowance. I labeled all of my pattern pieces so they're easier to identify. I marked the name of the project, the name of the pattern piece, how many to cut in each fabric, and the seam allowances. I'll mark the seam allowance at each seam if they're different sizes. I also use a different color marker depending on the fabric. I've also marked the bias grain line for the skirt pieces. The pattern says no obvious diagonals. Well, fuck you, I'm doing it. I'm only marking the pieces right now so I can make sure I have enough fabric before I cut it. I don't want my fabric falling off the table anywhere. That will pull and distort the fabric, so I use a weight to hold it on the table. I'm only cutting the skirt on the bias. I want the bodice to be cut across the straight grain. Now that I know I have enough fabric, I can cut my pieces. I'm going to do the same thing with my flat lining satin. The only difference is that I'm not cutting the skirt pieces on the bias. I'm cutting the bodice lining, belt lining, and pocket bag pieces out of cotton. Then the front yoke and belt out of the embossed leather. The leather scraps aren't big enough to cut the belt in one piece, so I'm cutting 3 pieces and I'll join them at the side seams. I have a lighter weight satin that I'm going to use for the skirt lining. Because the skirt lining is fitted, I want to add a bit more seam allowance for safety. When you sit down, your hip measurement increases a few inches, so I want to add an extra ½ inch at each side seam. The last thing I'm going to cut is my binding. I want 1½ inches for the fake binding on the bodice, and 2 inches for the real binding at the skirt hem. This is a good place to stop for today. I'll show you how to sew the dress in the next videos.